Okay, this is chapter 5. So we're going to look at adaptations now. So still in B1, and we're going to have a little look at how animals are adapted to suit their environment with a couple of specific examples that are mentioned in your specification, and how changes in the environment can affect the distribution of living organisms. So first, let's think about what plants and animals compete for then, and why they need to be adapted. So plants compete for light, space, water and nutrients in the soil. So they need all of those things to grow. Animals compete for food, mates and territory. So they need slightly different things. It's important to remember a couple of examples from there, so you've got that to write down for a question. So organisms have adaptations that enable them to survive in their conditions. So the better adapted they are, the more likely they're going to be able to compete for these things up here, making them more likely to survive. Some animals, though, actually live in quite extreme environment, and they're called extremophiles, and they are specially adapted to that environment, and there's not much that can live there. So, for example, we might be looking at bacteria that live in volcanic vents deep down into the oceans, and they have to be okay at living in very high temperatures and high pressures. So that's a very extreme environment. And for plants, we may get plants that live in salt marshes with very high salt level, and only specialised, well-adapted plants can live there. If we took a plant from a very low salt concentration or lived in a soil with very low salt concentration and put it into that salt marsh, it would die and it wouldn't be able to survive because it wouldn't have been adapted to that environment. So the specific examples they talk about in your specification is how plants might be adapted for a dry environment. So, for example, the cactus here, which you're familiar with seeing in desert pictures, etc., we may find that they change surface area. So, in particular, leaves is what you're going to want to focus on. So, some plants may have no leaves at all. Some may have very small leaves, because we know that water can be lost through the leaves, and we obviously don't want water to leave because it's in a dry condition. So they'll have very small leaves or no leaves at all. They'll have water storage tissues. They can store water when they've got it for a long period of time, and they have extensive root systems. Some of those can be quite shallow, just going underneath the surface just for any rainfall, but some may be incredibly deep, going right down to the bottom sort of water table area to try and find any water. Animals, there are a couple of things you need to be looking at here. So the specification touches on animals adapted for dry and Arctic environments, so kind of vice versa here. If it's in the Arctic, you may find that changes to surface area, referencing the fact that they might have very small ears so they don't lose much heat, whereas animals in a dry area, so deserts, the desert rat or desert fox, have really, really big ears. They have a large surface area so they can lose lots of heat. These two sort of link together really. In Arctic areas, we find animals that have a thick insulating coat and lots of body fat. So the polar bear is an example of that. And then animals in drier areas may have very, very fine hair, if any at all, and a very small amount of body fat. Again, just to keep that temperature loss at the maximum so they're not going to get too hot. And we've got camouflage, okay? So we know that animals that are well camouflaged are less likely to be seen by their predators, but also can hunt really well for their prey because they're not seen very easily. So, and there'll be different camouflage depending on the environment they live in. Other specific things for predation could be that animals and plants have thorns or poisons or warning colours, and these are in particular looking at how to prevent predators from attacking them. So plants that are in areas where they may be eaten by lots of herbivores, so sheep or cattle, etc., might be quite spiky to prevent them from being eaten. Animals and plants can contain poisons to prevent anything from eating them. If they do, start to kill them quite quickly. And some animals may have really bright warning colours to try and stop predators from eating them. So make sure you know a couple of really clear and specific examples, because these questions is areas where I tend to see students waffling without giving some solid evidence there for adaptations. So that's the adaptations part. Now we're going to look at how changes in the environment can affect distribution of living organisms, because they're no longer adapted well, so they may cause some movement. Okay, so different things can change. We can have non-living factors changing, like temperature. So this is climate change. We know temperature is increasing and it is causing some of our animals to distribute differently. For example, birds might migrate at different times now, which means if an animal is relying on those to migrate because they eat them for their prey, they're not migrating anymore, they have no prey, and that other animal dies. We may get a change in living factors though, like a change in competitor. So a new competitor comes in, which is more successful than the current top predator in that food chain, and the top predator gets moved out of the way for the new competitor coming in. Okay, and that can change distribution of those organisms in that area. We can monitor then these changes in the environment quite well with two different things. We can do environmental change, okay, and we can look at things using non-living indicators, so things like oxygen levels and temperature and rainfall, all of which we need to be able to know how to measure those. So obviously temperature using a thermometer, and rainfall, collecting the water that is passed down in rain, and we can then see how that's affecting the distribution of organisms. But we can also have living indicators. So lichen growing on the sides of trees or buildings can be a sign of air pollution, in particular sulfur dioxide, and invertebrates living in water, ponds, rivers, etc. Is a sign of water pollution. So there's not so much, it may be a sign that the dissolved oxygen concentration is really quite low, so you're not getting much invertebrate there at all. So they're living indicators of pollution, and these are non-living indicators of environmental change. Okay, so we've looked at how animals are adapted because what they need to compete for, some specific examples, okay, of how animals might be adapted for dry or Arctic conditions, and then how the environment can change and how we can monitor that change using living and non-living.